Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of Story Time. I'll be reading to you today from our early dismissal due to the severe storm watch, and the rain has just started to come down pretty hard here and canceled some of our outdoor sporting events tonight. So here we are. Today I'll be reading portions of the book Manhunt to you. This is a book from James L. Swanson. It was a New York Times bestseller, as it says. And the subtitle is The 12-Day Chase for Lincoln's Killer. So this book was actually given to me by a phys ed teacher from where I used to teach. So thank you if he's ever watches this. And it's pretty cool. It's cool, the right word. It's very interesting about the chase for Booth and how he averted authorities for almost 2 weeks. So where I'm going to pick off is not so much his escape, but the actual assassination. And something else I want to bring to mind in the excerpt I chose is that Lincoln wasn't the only person that they tried to kill that night. His Secretary of State, William Seward, was attacked at his house. And actually, Grant was supposed to be there that night. And for various reasons, he chose not to stay in D.C. He possibly could have been killed as well. Anyway, so I'm going to start off with the story of Secretary of State William Seward and his daughter Fanny. And this is after he was attacked. There was a struggle with the gun, but he was slashed with a knife. Ooh, all right. So both Booth and Lewis Powell had left behind so much blood. Sergeant Robinson and Fanny Seward worked feverishly to save the Secretary of State's life. Seward had more wounds than the sergeant had hands, and Robinson had to teach Fanny how to staunch the flow of blood with cloths and water. I did not know what should be done, she said. And this is Seward with his daughter. Robinson told me everything. Sprawled across sheets sheared by Powell's knife, she knelt beside her father and, with all of her strength, pressed the ersatz bandages tightly against the cuts. Robinson played doctor and examined Seward's body for additional wounds. Punctures to the lungs, stomach, or heart? Nope. Any nicked or severed arteries? No. If they could stop the bleeding and Seward could just hold on until Dr. Verity, Dr. Norris, or Surgeon General Barnes arrived, he might live. Within minutes, messengers returned with the doctors who relieved Fanny and Robinson. Their examination confirmed it. Despite their hideous appearance, the wounds were not fatal. Seward, who to Dr. Verity looked like an exaggerated corpse, would live. Verity turned to the family and spoke. I congratulate you all that the wounds are not mortal. Robinson finally allowed himself to be treated by the doctors. He too would live, along with Gus Seward and Hansel. But Powell had inflicted a grievous and potentially fatal wound upon Frederick Seward. The Whitney revolver fractured his skull and exposed his brain. Fred wandered about the house like a zombie, babbling the same phrase, it is, over and over, unable to complete the thought, while touching the back of his head with his finger. Fred smiled at Dr. Verity and seemed to recognize him. Verity, interpreting Fred's hand gesture, asked, You want to know whether your skull is broken or not? Yes, Fred replied. Within half an hour, Fred passed out every 15 or 20 minutes, then woke up. Verity and others helped him to bed, where he passed out again. When he wakened 3 days later, he had been unconscious for 60 hours, but he would live. As the evening wore on, Fanny became incessantly fearful that Powell might return. And this is Powell. He's the one who hit at them or struck them, tried to kill them. Or other assassins might be lurking in the house. Her mother ordered her not to wander off alone in the big mansion, but Fanny disobeyed, and prowling from room to room searched alone, until others joined her for concealed assassins. Finding none, she returned to her father's bed and sat beside him. Weakly, Seward lifted his left arm and opened a soothing hand to Fanny to calm and reassure her. His good, brave girl had done well this night. The house became quiet again. Everywhere she looked, Fanny saw signs of the horror that she and her family had just survived. All the white woodwork of the entry was covered with great dashes of blood, she wrote in her diary. The drugget on the stairs was sprinkled with it, all the way down to the floor below. On the inner side of the door, or father's room, there was, in blood, the distinct impression of a hand. Blood. Blood. My thoughts seemed drenched in it. It seemed to breathe its sickening odor. The bed had been covered with blood, the blankets and sheets chopped with several blows of the knife. Then she looked at herself, her hands, her arms, her long, pretty dress, all drenched in blood. She could not stop screaming. Sergeant Robinson, so this is him here, too, could not forget the blood, and later he saw the bizarre, gruesome relic of the battle that night. Might he, the fearless nurse Corey, the Secretary of War, have the knife that Powell used to stab him and Secretary Seward? Stanton granted the unusual request. And then there's actually a reading, which I won't need to read to you, but it's an actual letter that said that he can have that knife. Congress went one step further and proffered a generous and more conventional award. A gold medal was struck in Robinson's honor, and he was given $5,000 in cash. I wonder what that was worth at that time. The obverse of the medal included a bust portrait of Robinson's profile in high relief and the legend, "For his heroic conduct on the 14th day of April, 1865, in saving the life of William H. Seward." On the reverse, the engraver froze Robinson and Powell in perpetual combat, the assassin raising the knife high in the air while the sergeant held the striking arm at bay. Behind them, Seward lay helpless in bed, and Powell's revolver lay broken on the floor. The president's box at Ford's Theater was also drenched in blood. After Boots leaped to the stage, the women attended to their men. Mary Lincoln turned to her left and stared at the president. He was motionless in the rocker, his head long low, eyes shut, his chin resting on his chest. He did not return her imploring gaze. She spoke to him, but he did not answer. She touched him. He did not stir. "Father, father," she shouted into his right ear, just a few inches away. Lincoln did not react. Now frantic, Mary moved closer and tried to push his body into a more upright position. The muscles in his neck, shoulders, chest, and arms, all limp, offered no resistance. Lincoln had no visible wounds. There was no blood on his face or neck. His white linen shirt was unstained. Her touch left no wet red spots upon her hands. But her loving hands had overlooked the back of his head. Mary Lincoln, terrified, uncomprehending, and by now nearly hysterical, clutched her husband's body and supported it in the sitting position in the chair. And this is Clara Harris, who was a socialite at the time, who was in the box with them. Clara Harris lifted her eyes from the stage below and looked back into the box. She beheld Rathbone, wild-eyed, staggering, and clutching his upper left arm with his right hand. She could not suppress the copious flow of blood that flooded over his hand and dripped on the luxurious Turkish carpet. Booth had struck him hard, and the knife had penetrated deep. Clara, who had seen the whole thing, never forgot the forceful swing of Booth's practiced and powerful arm. Superficially, Rathbone's wound appeared small, just a narrow puncture of the skin near the elbow, no more than about 1.5 inches wide, mimicking the dimensions of the blade. But the knife had sliced deep inside the major's raised, parrying arm, parallel to the bone, and nearly to the shoulder, cutting an artery, nerves, and veins. Most of the damage was beneath the skin. Clara rushed to attend her fiancé's wound. Down in the audience, more than 1,500 people went wild. Some playgoers climbed to the stage, looked up to the box, and shouted, despite queries to its occupants, "What has happened? Is the president alive?" Throughout the theater, hundreds of people turned to friends, spouses, and total strangers, all repeating the same questions. "Has the president been shot? Who was the man on stage? Was that a knife? What did he say?" Some women fainted. Innumerable, half-crazed voices cried out of the corners of the theater in the frightening chorus of vengeance. "Kill the murderer! Hang him! Shoot him! Cut his heart out! Catch him! Don't let him escape!" None of them realized that the assassin was already out the back door, safe from the reach of the vigilante howls. Like a violent spring storm, the climate inside Ford's became dark, ugly, and menacing. Under the dim glow of the hissing gaslights, people pushed one another to get to the stage. Others, in a panic to flee, shoved men, women, and children out of the aisles. The voices grew louder until nearly all 1,500 of them came together to create an angry roar. This was a mob. Other voices, these pleading for assistance, not roaring for vengeance, arose from the mob. Water! Has anyone any stimulants? Stand back! Give him air! Is there a doctor in the house? In the dress circle, sitting just a few yards from the door to the president's box, Charles Leal jumped up from his seat. Disregarding the aisles and customary route to the box, he raced there in a direct line, and, like a hurdler gone haywire, staggered and half vaulted over the cane-bottomed chairs obstructing his path as he shouldered his way past dazed playgoers. He joined a number of other men who were trying to get inside the box, but the door was locked. Inside, Major Rothbone walked toward the door, toward the sound of the beating fists. The men were pounding on the door like it was a drumhead, but their fists and shoulders could not break it open. They shouted to the occupants, if any of them were still alive, to unlock the door. Rothbone staggered forward, already feeling the effects of blood loss and shock. He cupped the hand of his good arm under the wooden music stand that Booth used to bar the door, and tried to pull it up. It wouldn't budge. He tried harder, then realized that the harder the men on the other side pushed, the more effective Booth's device became. It was too thick to snap, so every push created a tighter seal between the door panel and the head of the bar. "For God's sake, open the door!" the voices pleaded. Rothbone shouted through the door to stop pushing. The door was barred. The men obeyed Rothbone's order and stepped back. Weakening rapidly, Rothbone pulled up with his remaining strength. The music stand popped free, and nearly a dozen men rushed inside. Dr. Leal, not in uniform, announced his rank and profession and stepped ahead of them. Immediately, he saw all four occupants. Like an officer under enemy fire, he needed to regain his composure. "Halt!" he commanded everyone silently. "Do not panic." "Be calm," he chided himself. "Do your duty." Major Rothbone, standing between Leal and Lincoln, beseeched the doctor to treat him first, and as a proof of his injury, he ostentatiously used his right hand to hold up his wounded left arm. Leal lifted Rothbone's chin, peered into his eyes, and, when an almost instantaneous glance revealed the fact that he was in no immediate danger, ignored the emotional major and rushed to the president's side. Leal approached Mary Lincoln and introduced himself as the United States Army surgeon. Wordlessly, she thrust out her hand, and he grasped it tightly. Then she unleashed a torrent of pitiful pleas. "Oh, doctor, is he dead? Can he recover? Will you take charge of him? Do what you can for him. Oh, my dear husband." The doctor assured the First Lady that he would do everything possible for her husband. As Mary wept bitterly, Leal released her hand and began his examination. Lincoln looked dead. His eyes were closed, he wasn't conscious, and his head had fallen forward. Leal concluded, from Lincoln's crouched sitting posture, that if Mary had not held his body upright in the rocking chair, the president would have already tumbled to the floor. Leal took Lincoln's right radial pulse, but felt no movement of the artery. Just to be sure, Leal and others lifted Lincoln from the rocker and laid him in a recumbent position on the floor. While Leal held the president's head and shoulders, one of his hands felt a wet spot, invisible to the eye, on the left shoulder of Lincoln's black frock coat. It was a clot of blood. Leal, remembering Booth's flashing dagger on stage and noting Rathbone's severely bleeding wound, assumed that Lincoln had been stabbed. Leal called for a knife. He brought no surgeon's tools to a social night at the theater. If Lincoln had been stabbed, how could he suture the wounds without needles and thread? By now, several men had joined Rathbone in the box, and hands began fishing wildly in pants pockets, until William Kent, government employee, produced a pocket knife. Leal removed Lincoln's custom-made black wool frock coat, trimmed at the collar. Lapels and cuffs were grosgrain piping. The box was too dimly lit to read the tailor's label sewn inside the collar. Brooks Brothers, New York. Or to admire the black silk lining embossed with a large American eagle, a shield of stars and stripes, and the motto, "One country, one destiny." Leal cut open Lincoln's collar, shirt, and coat to examine him for knife wounds. There were none. Then Leal lifted each of the president's eyelids, studied the pupils, and reeled in dismay. It was a brain injury. Leal separated his fingers, weaved both of his hands gently through Lincoln's hair, and as he worked them thoroughly around his head, he discovered that the hair was matted with blood. Leal's fingers probed rapidly for its source, and found it within seconds. Behind the left ear, a neat round hole, about the diameter of a man's fingertip, clotted with a plug of wine-red coagulated blood. Leal's heart sank. And that's how he knew he was shot in the brain. So if we want to hear more of this, let me know. We can learn more about how they treated Lincoln across the street or about Boots' life on the run.